Well, Mr. President, I don't have a dog in this hunt, but I will say that the gay ray or gay bomb is in the interest of national security, and we must support it with everything we have.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show's interviews.
Magic and music, the same thing. Music is what keeps Nola humming. It's what makes her the city she is.
Hey, I'm Sean.
I'm Brandon.
And joining us on today's show is none other than Alex Jennings, a super geek who loves the Incredible Hulk. I know that from personal experience. Geek movies, poetry, and so much more. He was, according to the internet, born in Germany, raised in many places. At some point I will ask him about. And presently enjoys the company of New Orleans. And yes, I said enjoys the company of, because the city is alive and I will take no other alternative position on that. His debut, The Ballad of Perilous Graves, is out via Red Hook on June 21st, 2022. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
We are very thrilled to have you here because you told me about this book last year, and I've been waiting for a very long time. How dare time go so slow?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
The minute I heard about this book, because I think Sean was like one of the first people to like message me after privately and go, "Yo, this book is really dope. We should talk about the thing." I was like, "Okay, let me look at this thing," and it's actually amazing, and I'm very excited to dig into more of it with you during this interview. But before we begin talking about the book, of course, we must ask you first. What is the Ballad of Perilous Graves?
The Ballad of Perilous Graves is a sort of blaxploitation Pippi Longstocking adventure where 9 songs of power have escaped from Professor Longhair's enchanted piano and manifested around the city as colorful street people. And my Pippi character and her crew have to find these songs and return them home before the city begins to crumble.
Much exciting. Yeah, so we have to get the big thing out of the way because this book is set in New Orleans. That is also where you live. Now, New Orleans, this immediately made me go, okay, well, what other genre fiction has been set in New Orleans? Because I was immediately curious because I know a number of authors have written it. And so I went looking, and some obvious big examples, a bunch of Anne Rice books have been set there. Poppy Z. Bright's Exquisite Corpse. Gambit from the X-Men is obviously there. I know you know about that, Alex, because I don't know your position on Gambit. Maybe one day we'll ask you. Monica Rambeau's also from there. And then there's films like All Dogs Go to Heaven, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, apparently Dracula 2000, which I've forgotten, and a lot more, including non-genre films also set there. Disney even has a part of its parks that is dedicated to the aesthetics and sounds of the area of New Orleans. And so here you are writing in this stunning and unique city, making music into magic because it is magic. And I have to ask, why do you think New Orleans continues to have like such a huge draw, whether it's on us artistically or just on people in general? Like, why? What is it about the city?
Well, I think New Orleans is a sort of cultural nexus point where, one of the most recent worldwide art movements was born. And it was born very organically, like filtering up from the underclass and the criminal class and becoming something, instead of to be ashamed of, it's become something to be treasured all over the world. And I think that sort of alchemy, where that spirit of jazz entered the world, carried a lot of spiritual and emotional force that's still reverberating. And I think that's probably what drew me to this place.
So okay, then I have to ask the secondary related question. So did you choose New Orleans or did it choose you?
Well, I first started coming here in 2003. Like on a whim, my brother and I came down when we were off work one weekend. and like we fell in love with the place. Like there was just a sort of aura and atmosphere to it that we found truly moving. And so we went back home, and I think we came down one more time. And I had a powerful dream one night where I was commanded by some sort of spirit to move to New Orleans and stop living in the DMV on the East Coast. And it took me, I don't know, probably 18 months to get that together. And in the intervening time, Hurricane Katrina happened. And then we came down to take a look at things and see if the city was still livable. And in the end, like we came on down, and I've been here ever since, like these 16 years now, I think. Almost exactly 16.
Wow.
That's quite a story. But it like immediately pivots into one of the questions that I definitely want to ask. Because I'm very big, obviously, and Sean knows this, on stories with very strong voices. And even though I'm sure I should be honest by saying that I don't know a lot about Nola dialect, what I can hear and see in the book sounds very strong and distinct in a way that I think is obviously an attempt to do that dialect justice. And I'm kind of curious now, especially because you weren't born in New Orleans, how you gravitated towards telling that story in that strong dialect, not only for the story itself, but individually as a writer. What was the significance that for you to write in that voice?
Well, I think part of it comes down to the fact that New Orleans is very much in a real life battle for its soul right now. There are a lot of things happening to erode the culture, erode the significance of music, and like disenfranchise the people who are born and raised from here. And like that was something that was clear to me even before Hurricane Katrina. And so when I was making the decision about whether to move down after the storm, I was very conscious of not wanting to take up space meant for people who are born and raised here. And so when I did move to the city, I was selling some short stories here and there, but I waited for at least 3 years before I set anything here because I knew that I could not speak on the city and its life as accurately or as faithfully as people who have been immersed in the culture since birth. So that's one of the reasons why NOLA is separate from New Orleans in that way, and like the two cities can comment on each other. But I was very conscious of not wanting to create what I claim to be the definitive voice of the city, um, because for me it's much more about listening than speaking. I think
Mhm.
I was very blessed to have like those voices come to me and like kind of enter my consciousness, and I think that's why a lot of the book feels like it originated outside me.
It's an interesting way of describing it, and I really appreciate that you had this sort of awareness of like your place in, even within this country to which you are now, you're a part of, this sense of like there are different subcultures and sub spaces to which there is their own unique culture, that you don't just necessarily get to grab it whenever you want, that there's a need to take the time and learn it, and to feel that you have a right to speak to that culture, and I thought that part of what you were saying too was really interesting, which is that you know Katrina comes up obviously in this, and it is interesting that you also explore this in a way throughout in the book, of like the way that cities can become scarred by their past, and non-scarred too. There are the nice things. The music can be this very beautiful part of it, but like Casey's story, for example, you have this great line that just stuck with me, and I had to write it down, where he's talking about the city and its changes very early in the book. And he says, to be fair, the city looked better than it had when he'd first returned after the storm, yet the scars were still evident but miasma of injury had faded, or at least transformed into something quieter as sort of background static. And I was curious about, as you were, you moved to the city and you were sort of learning about this city and looking at the way the city was, essentially coming through all of this adversity. Um, how did that sort of affect as you were writing this particular book in sort of capturing to some degree the soul of the city in your own writing?
Well, it was a really strange circumstance to move down here in the summer of 2006. Um, the city and its people were still very much in pain in a way that was often swept aside or went unacknowledged by outsiders, both near and far. It was important to me to be able to listen to those stories that people had, and instead of like consuming them and kind of devouring them, like sitting with them and holding space for them, and like sort of extending my senses into the world around me. Like I moved around to a lot of places before landing here, and this is the first environment that I feel like I've really integrated myself with. And it took a long time. It took 7 years, which was already almost longer than I'd lived anywhere else in the world. But yeah, it was very strange. Like a lot of stuff was different at the time because of Hurricane Katrina. Like all of the public transportation was still free, even though it was, vastly reduced in capacity from where it had been before the storm. There were certain streets that were cut off by construction for years. And I think one of the things that makes it so strange is like to describe the city as it was then, to describe the city as it was now, and to describe the city as it was during the Cotton Expo in 1850, like there are huge commonalities. Like there's a continuity of spirit and of I don't know how else to term it other than manner. Like the city's bearing is still exactly the way it was back then. Like, when I was putting together the idea for this book, I went and read a lot of the works of Lafcadio Hearn, where he's describing like the foodways and the culture and the people of New Orleans, and it was all instantly recognizable, even down to the statue of Andrew Jackson in Jackson Square and the pelican that would perch atop it. Anyway, I could talk about this for a long time, but I'll leave it there.
Did by any chance did you look into the work of Zora Neale Hurston? Because I know Hurston did some ethnography on some of the folk tales of New Orleans. I think in Mules and Men. I can't remember.
I did touch on some of that, especially not as much for this work, but for earlier works. Like I wrote this story called Boudreaux and Thibodeau. It's kind of like a zombie horror story set in New Orleans, and for that, because it's based around these Boudreaux and Thibodeau jokes, which I mean, they're iterations of jokes that we have in like all sorts of subcultures in the country. But I looked at the differences between the white versions of those jokes and the black versions of those jokes, and there were even some like Creole variations. And I did come across some really interesting stuff from Hurston during that period as well, especially her essay where she met the former zombie. That was a big one for me.
Oh, I've not read that one yet. I'll need to hunt that down.
I encountered that one early, like much earlier. I think when I was in middle school or something, and it ruined me. Like I had seen the Serpent and the Rainbow and things like that, and so I understood zombies as movie monsters. And finding out that there's any sort of version of that in real life, like whether they're actually dead and revived or not, it's too close, man. It opened up a dark corner of the world that like I think kind of cracked my brain a little bit.
Have you, okay, so secondary question then, since we've mentioned sort of the classical zombie, not the classic movie zombie, but the more traditional zombie. Haints obviously show up in this story. Uh, and I'm curious, do you have a story of your exposure to either the idea or actual haints that you sort of inspired that?
I mean, I short answer is yes, but the long answer is
Okay.
I am not completely sure. One thing I have to note is that ghosts are not called haints here. That's more of an Eastern thing. But the word, it just has this flavor that I really enjoy, and I decided to integrate it into like the vernacular of the people in this fantastical version of New Orleans because I just love the way it sounds. Like there's just something about it
Mm-hmm.
that's so cool to me. But like, okay, so here's my story. I don't know if I've ever seen a ghost. All I do is like lay out the facts of what happened and let people decide for themselves. Some people feel that what I was seeing was a ghost. Some people feel like it wasn't. But this is back in the first apartment that I lived in here in New Orleans in the French Quarter, which was an old camelback house. And the landlord lived in the upstairs, which was like the camelback part. And like my brother and I lived downstairs in like this, decent sized apartment with like the fireplaces that had been bricked up and like a checkerboard linoleum floor in the kitchen. And so my daily habit was that I would get up and I would go into the kitchen before I showered and get myself a cup of English breakfast tea. I was drinking tea at that time for some reason. And so one morning, as I turned to go back out of the kitchen and head to my room, I see a guy standing by the mantelpiece in the dim of the living room. He was wearing very old timey clothes. He had his hair tied back in a ribbon. He had a greatcoat on and like a kind of like ruffled cravat or whatever. And I remember the buckles on his shoes. And he seemed just as shocked to see me as I was to see him. And then as I'm looking at him, this must have taken about like 45 seconds total. Instead of disappearing, like he just the shape of him translated itself into various shapes in the dim of the room, like a bust of Mozart, paper sitting on my brother's computer desk, the edge of the couch, and he was gone, right? So I figured, well, this is probably an optical illusion brought on by the exact time and angle and mood and manner, and I wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, so I should be able to recreate the situation and make myself imagine this guy again. And so I tried just about every weekday for the next 6 months, and I never pulled it off. So I don't know. Was that a ghost? It could have been. It could also have been like that we were somehow seeing each other across time. And like this guy's like, what is this slave doing walking around in a dressing gown like he owns the
Oh,
place? So,
so he was
Oh
a
wow.
white guy.
oh yeah, he was definitely a white guy.
That changes that context a lot.
Hmm.
Yes, terribly.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not an expert on these things, but it who knows? It could be. It's possible. It's certainly, at the very least, a very strange experience
It was.
that clearly continues to haunt you. So,
I don't even think of myself as someone who like believes in ghosts. Like, I don't immediately discount people's experiences when I hear them, but I'm also not willing to like dot that I and cross that T and be like, well, there's ghosts.
Hmm. I have not I have not had an experience like that myself, but I'm willing to bet. I think you saw a ghost. I don't know how else that happens. So one of the questions that I have about this book, as a very avid reader and as someone in particular who thinks a lot about young adult SFF and like what we make available for young readers and how we let young people see themselves in fantasy stories in particular. One of the things that actually drew my attention in terms of the voices of these characters is, um, in a lot of ways, it is not immediately obvious what age range this book is for, and I think that that's actually kind of rad. I love that Perry and Brandy are very young, but that Casey is obviously older than them, and that their experiences of Nola are totally different as a result. And I'm kind of curious, like, what inspired you to tell the exact same story through the perspectives of people who are of young people who are that different in age, and who you think as a result this story is for, in that generic YA versus middle grade kind of perspective.
Like again, there's like a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is I'm aiming at the kid I was at the age of 11, who did not like reading books for kids. I had no time for that at that point. I was reading Stephen King and like a lot of stuff that I really shouldn't have got my hands on that early. But the long answer is when I first moved down to New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, there were all of these stories that I would read in the news or hear through word of mouth about kids who were forced to return to the city after the storm without their parents and like basically manage themselves and make sure that they ate and got to school and things like that. And so thinking about that immediately led me to the greatest kid that I knew of who lived without parents or rules or anything like that, and that was Pippi Longstocking. So I started thinking about, well, if I was to take Pippi Longstocking out of her milieu and situate her in, post Katrina New Orleans, like what would she and her adventures look like? And like the story grew out of that.
Nice. Because, like, I do think one of the things that I think I like the most about this book, especially through the lens of Perry and Brandy and Peaches, is that the things that they see and experience are not new to them. We're not witnessing, like a lot of other fantasy stories, the story of young people learning that there is something spectacular about the world. We're actually witnessing people who have already discovered that something is beautiful and magical about Nola, and are now learning more about it and learning what they can do to actually defend that space. And I think that that's really neat. And I think that it's neat as a result, that even though Perry, as our point of view character, has all of these like very deep experiences about this world, there are things that he not only doesn't know and is given the opportunity to learn, but there are things that he does know, and the story gives us opportunities to witness why those things are also special when the ways that he learns them are not very special. Like, I think when Deke teaches him to use memories as an opportunity to get into his dreams, and they're describing this like absolutely new thing that he is like making up, having breakfast on the moon, and I'm like, this is just a really nice vignette story, but it's also this really interesting opportunity to learn more about Perry as a character and learn about like the ways that he views himself and the world, and how those things will eventually give him tools that will make the rest of the journey interesting. And I think that Perry is like the protagonist that I wish I was reading books of when I read books. So I dig this a lot.
Yeah, I that's exactly what I was going for. Like I wanted him to be the kind of kid that it would be cool to be around and like have the sense of like tagging along with his crew and the sense of danger with the situations that they get into, but also the sense of joy amid this difficulty, which I feel is kind of core to the experience, not just of blackness in New Orleans, but of blackness, period. And, it comes from my father. Like, Perry is sort of a child version of my dad. And it took me years to realize that as I was working on the book. But like my mind kept returning to this incident when, my dad used to read Tolkien to me and my little brother every night. And there's a lot of like black is evil imagery, and like in one of the older editions of The Hobbit, like the orcs are clearly rendered as like black people, just with like fangs and pug noses and stuff. And like one night, my dad put the book down and said, I wish there was a fantasy where everyone was black and the darkest, blackest one was the hero. And so as I kind of embarked on this journey, I thought about that all the time.
That's really neat. Because one of the things that I think, like, there are a lot of things that I like about this book. But of course, one of the things that also really touches me is the fact that it's deeply connected to jazz and has created this opportunity as a result where, in the fantastic language of this world, music is literally a living thing, several living things, even. And all of those song characters are themselves also black. And I thought that that was really not only this like very powerful incidental commentary on the fact that jazz is an obviously black art form and obviously is tied to the cultural fabric of this place, but this very interesting opportunity to like tell this story about young people who are not disconnected from jazz as part of their culture in the way that a lot of young people in the present day are often kind of disconnected from elements of their culture that are not like immediately popular in this point in time. And I thought that that was really powerful, and I kind of wanted to ask as a result, what about jazz as a magical element in this world was interesting to you, and what do you want young people in particular to get about jazz through the process of reading this book?
Well, there are a lot of facets to that. There are so many facets to what jazz is and how it can be experienced both in New Orleans and beyond New Orleans. The art form is very, very integrated into like the day to day life of the city. It's not unusual to walk outside your door and hear somebody practicing on their horn like a couple blocks away. It's also not surprising or unusual to see a second line march by on a weekend morning. And that's even before you get into the festivals like Mardi Gras, like Jazz Fest and things like that. So there's a vitality to jazz and an immediacy to it here that is pretty unparalleled anywhere else. Like kids learn how to play brass instruments early on. Like they start in elementary school, and like if you had told me 25 years ago that one day jazz and marching band music would be two of my favorite forms of music, I would have told you to go screw. Like that's insane to me. But like the first time I came to the city, there was a certain like openness and hauntedness to it. And a lot of people would tell you that after Hurricane Katrina, the city became less haunted for a while. Like there just seemed to be much less spiritual activity. It was kind of tamped down. Although I did have one dream shortly after I moved here. I won't get into that right now. That was very spiritual and not fun. But I always had the feeling that these spirits are active in our lives and that they walk among us and that they influence our thinking and our sense of joy and our traditions. And I wanted to bring that to an audience in a way that they could connect with. And like, whenever you're doing something like that, it can be hard to draw the distinction between what people are going to think are like the basic eyeball kicks of SFF literature and like what are things lifted from real cultures and real life. And like so much of that is definitely real.
And I do want to like follow up very quickly about that with another thing, which is there are lyrics that you've written into the book. Like, so I read it, and when I saw that, I was like, now I want to hear it. I'm not sure if the audiobook is out yet. I'm pretty sure it isn't yet. But as a result, I kind of want to ask, when like when you wrote those things, did you like hear it in your head? Were you actually like singing those things aloud, or is was that like as just another part of the writing process for you? Because I know you have poetry experience as well, but I know that when I tinker with things that are supposed to be more melodic, I am actually hearing that song in my head.
Oh yeah,
I kind of want to know if that process is the same for you.
yeah. I definitely heard the songs in my head. Like originally, all of the songs in the book were real songs. Because as I was writing, I didn't know that you can't use more than two lines of a song without paying licensing fees. And so when I found that out, I decided I was just going to have to go through and write all my own songs. And so every time I would come to a passage with a song, I would try and distill it down to the main vibe of the song and the main feel and kind of like the sort of rhythm that it had and go for something similar to that was definitely not that. The only two real songs used in the book are St. James Infirmary Blues and oh no, it's just the one. Because I tried to get the license to use "Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans" for the finale, and we couldn't settle on a deal, so I just like sat down and wrote my own.
Wow. I really want to hear what these things sound like in the audiobook, because I think that would be really cool. But now that I know that you did have real songs in the draft of this book, I'm kind of curious, what's your favorite jazz song, even if it wasn't one that you had selected for this moment?
Wow, that's a really tough one. My favorite jazz song. But I think right now it's Leslie Odom's version of "Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out." There's just something there's just something so smooth and seemingly effortless about the way he interprets that song. I just really love it. I've been listening to it a lot. But then I don't know. There's some Champion Jack Dupree songs that almost take the crown. Frankie and Johnny is a good one. That whole first record of his, Blues from the Gutter, is just one of the best albums of all time. And Champion Jack stands the test, man. Like, I love that guy's work. Anyway, and like one of the strangest things about New Orleans is like how highly the music and the tradition is prized here, but also how poorly musicians are often treated here, like systemically and in light of like institutionalized racism and even just like common disregard. Like it's a very strange sort of contradiction where they're revered and also ignored.
In some way, then, is the Ballad of Perilous Graves kind of a response to that? Because this version of the city is one where, at least from Perry's perspective in particular, like this is like that opening chapter right there. The Dr. Professor just shows up and is like singing a song, and like they just like let themselves be taken by it, and they're just like dancing and all of that. Do you kind of see the book in a way as a kind of response to the real world in that way?
It definitely is. Like not always consciously, and it's not always a sort of one to one comparison, but it's a response to the world and the city as I experience it, you know, filtered through my preoccupations and attitudes and like my own personal struggles. And so it's very much informed by what I step outside and see right outside my door. So like it's a common thing for jazz to start playing. Like you didn't know there was a second line coming by today, and it's 11 o'clock, and they're on their way back from the graveyard, so they're playing hot, and people are just following them down the street with handkerchiefs and just waving them and dancing. And it's very spontaneous and planned at the same time. And I think one of the things that fascinated me so much about my study of music here is the way tradition provides a framework for spontaneity and freedom of expression and like a new living experience of everything.
And I hope that, like, when young readers in particular read the book, they get like some sense of attachment to that this is theirs, and that it's not like something too ancient or old fashioned for them to enjoy, because there is a world that it can exist in where it doesn't happen anymore.
Right. It's like that whole experience is very valuable to me. The essay that I mentioned earlier that I'm writing right now is about culture shock and the role that's played in my life and in my writing. Because like culture shock is such an important element of SFF literature in the first place, and having that experience of moving from one culture into another so many times in my life has kind of positioned me uniquely to understand something both from within and without, and to be able to observe my observation of it and keep a perspective that allows me to be faithful and truthful without trying to take over these conversations or set myself up as some sort of expert on the city and its people, when that's not something like A, it's not something that I am, and B, it's not something that I ever set out to be.
Well, can I ask a writing question? Because I can't say that I have the same amount of at least global moving experience as you. I have moved quite a bit in the United States, and I'm wondering if you find that it is sometimes like, so a lot of writers, they like to write about places that are important to them. And so they'll draw on cities where they were raised, or those kinds of things. But when you move around a lot, it can sometimes feel hard to feel rooted into a place, like that you belong there, that it is really your home. And it can sometimes also then be hard, if you move far away from a place where you were born, that place changes eventually. Did you find it, as you were pursuing writing and growing as a writer, that affected or made it difficult to write, or did you not find it difficult and you just kind of moved past it?
It never made it difficult to write, but sometimes it required more attention towards calibrating my voice and like aiming my writing in the appropriate direction for like whatever given task. And so, for this novel, it was a much larger experience of that, in which like I had to first orient myself, and I'm sort of like, building this bridge as I walk across it, but at the same time I want to make sure that I'm stepping in the right places as I'm laying the tiles down. I think it was difficult in that respect, but I think that aspect of it was sort of overshadowed by the enormity of the task set in front of me. Like, so, I started this book 10 years ago, and I was writing a story that I didn't really understand and didn't have the capability to pull off. And so, in order to make it cohere, I needed to sharpen my skills and my experience to the point where I could be the person that could write this. And so the process changed me, and it changed my perspective on writing in general. And it also moved this story from being something that I thought was going to be a comic book, and B, possible to get out to market quickly while I focused on my real writing. And instead it became like the great work of my life. And it's the one thing that I have produced. And I'm proud of a lot of my stuff. But like if I were to get hit by a bus tomorrow, this book were to come out on Tuesday, like I couldn't be but so aggrieved, because I'm like, this says everything that I needed to say at that point.
I mean, not the knock on wood. We would like it very much if you didn't get hit by a bus. But all else notwithstanding, that's actually really sweet. One of the things that I wanted to ask, because we had spoken earlier before we started recording about the great breadth of things that you do. You're also a poet. You also write nonfiction, and you have a column that's coming out very soon in FNSF very soon. You let us know earlier that you used to do stand up. And so, like, one of the things that tends to fascinate me a lot when I know people who are both poets and fiction as well is how you know what writing voice you're using when you do the work. Like how, like whether you're attempting to be poetic or prosaic in this moment, if that really makes any sense. Because the answer that I've gotten from a lot of people is that very often it doesn't make sense. But like in particular, how do you know when the thing that you're working on is one thing or another? And are there ever moments when you're working on a project and you're like, but this could also be this other thing. This could be just a song. This could be a poem. This could be a poetry collection. Because especially the lyrics that you've written could very well have turned this book into a novel in verse if you wanted it to. How did you know that this was the job that you wanted these words to do when you like finally finished this draft?
Well, at least in the earlier stages, I don't pay that much attention to what I want a work to be. Like this kind of feeds into my sort of quasi mystical approach to writing and making art, in which I feel like my job more than anything is not to express myself or to say a thing, but to get out of the way as much as I can so that something external can communicate through me as clearly as possible. Like, while I do know that that's kind of illusory, at the same time, it works for me on a mechanical level and at several levels, to the point where if I was in a scene and it wasn't working for me and I didn't understand why, the way I would handle that is I would go out to the courtyard in the back of my apartment complex, sit by the pool with a notebook, and I would interview the character whose perspective that scene was in and ask them what really happened. And like the first time I came up with that idea, I was like, that is the dumbest, most like woo woo thing. It doesn't make any sense. But I mean, shit is worth a shot. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I? I don't know.
You
No,
can
you go
curse.
right ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I sat down and did it for a scene in this book, actually, and like the character was answering my questions, and like of course, I know that I was sort of like tricking my mind into synthesizing a sort of autonomy for this thing that was definitely just me, but it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, like what we do with each work, with each piece of fiction, with each poem doesn't really matter on a cosmic scale. And that's what makes our choices matter so much. And so I try to remain in conversation with the work until it goes out from me and it belongs to the world and not myself anymore. I like to put its understanding of what it wants to be first in my mind and in my heart. And so anytime there's uncertainty, I will go back to the work itself and ask it, like, what are you trying to tell me? What are you trying to express in the world? And like, am I getting in the way of that? And how do I keep that from happening? And I mean, it seems to be working out all right.
I'm inclined to agree.
Well, okay. I think we got to wind down, not because we can't talk more, but because we could talk probably for another hour just with you, and then also another hour just for the book. But I think out of respect for everyone's time, and especially yours, Alex, we can't do that.
I mean, we
You've got a
can.
life.
Nothing's stopping us, but it would be
Well,
a terrible idea for all involved.
I mean, honestly, I'm having a good time. I don't mind running over. If y'all don't mind running over, like, it's up to you. It's y'all's show.
well, let me ask a silly question, just out of curious. What actually is your opinion of Gambit?
Oh,
Oh God.
okay. Gambit is all wrong. Like, Gambit would be so much more fun if he was like realistic. Like, first of all, they have him being from New Orleans. New Orleans is not Cajun country. That he would be from Lafayette or New Iberia. This whole thing of the Thieves Guild, what he would mainly be thieving is copper wire out of building sites. He'd have a Caesar cut, puka shell necklace, Jinko jeans, and like it's weird how they slip these French phrases into his speech, which is not like that's not how Cajuns actually do that. Like there's a difference to it, and like also it's filtered through the whole like Cajun subculture. So they'll say something that sounds like a word that but is not. They'll call people boss, which is like their version of boy. And Gambit, as far as I know, has never said anything like that. I'm telling you, like, I would love for Gambit to be done realistically in live action or something and be from like New Iberia or Lafayette and wind him up and watch him go. Because like I like the concept generally. I just like the execution is just kind of lacking. Oh, also I feel like if he was a real person, he would be a juggalo or a reformed juggalo.
A
Oh, wow.
reformed juggalo. There are such things.
Absolutely. There's so many. In fact, when I was doing stand up, one of my friends had this character that he would do, Gaston Hebert, the Juggalo comic, and he would like sell out venues in Lafayette because everybody wanted to come see him do his thing, and it was hilarious. Lane Lanion, I think he's doing comedy in Denver now.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, I agree with you. Like, I really like, especially in the 90s X-Men cartoon, Gambit is so fun to listen to. I'm sure the accent's not quite right, but of all the characters, like, yeah, like Wolverine's fun, but after a while you're just like, could you just not be miserable and be a jerk all the time? But anytime Gambit comes on, you're like, oh, come on, sweet talk him. Let's go. Let's go. Speak some French. Do it. But you're right. He's not correct. And it's such an easy fix. They could just fix it.
They really
and it'd
could.
be fine. Yeah.
I feel like Gambit was written by and for people who think that like New Orleans is supposed to be a weird and strange thing for people to consume, and that's why
Mm-hmm.
he exists the way that he exists. I was actually kind of curious as an aside, since we're apparently down this rabbit hole. Alex, have you seen the Marvel TV series Cloak and Dagger?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'm kind of curious what your feelings about how that portrays New Orleans are, because I think that was one of the best Marvel productions that they've ever made, and I'm very upset that it only got 2 seasons.
They mostly do a pretty good job. Like there weren't too many things that jumped out at me where I was like, this doesn't fit. I will say that his costume, like that hood that he wears, that he supposedly got from his Mardi Gras Indian daddy, like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like that's not really something that would be lying around a Mardi Gras Indian's house. Because like that subculture, it's fascinating for one thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
they make these elaborate suits. They make them every year, and time was as soon as they got done with their last performance for the year, they would throw them into the fire and start on a new one. Nowadays, like they're donating them to museums and stuff like that, so they don't all just burn. But like that intricate beadwork is something that they're always on, and like you just wouldn't have a cloak like that lying around the house. An aside about the Mardi Gras Indians, like that subculture is so crazy that they used to face off against each other in what is now the parking lot of the Greyhound station downtown, and like go at it with straight razors, and like sometimes people wound up dead. Nowadays there's no violence to it. Like the battles are all very stylized, and they're just through dancing and chanting. Yeah, because they had to stop that stuff in the 50s or get stamped out.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I got to go back to something that was said earlier because I'm curious what Alex thinks about this. So when Brandon, you had said like that Gambit feels like a character written by people who think of New Orleans as this exotic thing, it made me immediately think of Live and Let Die, the Bond movie, which does feature New Orleans, because one of the fascinating things about that movie, and this is not the only time they've ever gone like vaguely in that territory where you start getting like Creoles and so on. Um, but one of the things is like the very first time we see it is it's like a funeral procession playing music, carrying a giant coffin, and they off a guy, and then they just like lay the coffin over him, and then like it slips a thing under, and then they lift the coffin up so like no one sees the body, which is cool. Probably not what actually happens in New Orleans. But then they also have a character by the name of Baron Samedi, played by an actor originally, by the way, Brandon, from Trinidad and
Oh
Tobago,
yeah,
Jeffrey Holder.
I
Uh,
have a lot of feelings about Jeffrey Holder. I
Oh,
also have a
he,
lot of
Jeffrey
feelings about
Holder.
Baron Samdi, but
but he plays this very like I don't know what he's supposed to like. He seems like a figure out of like a Caribbean carnival. Like that's what he seems like he's supposed to be. He comes across as this like witch doctor voodoo chaos master. Like, and it's bizarre, but every time Bond goes to the Caribbean, New Orleans, any of those like vaguely south where there's lots of black people hanging out, that's almost always how those movies treat those areas. They're like super exotic and unusual. We have to show the most sensational version of it because it's probably written by people who like their version of their understanding of that was they got a set of the encyclopedia. Like,
Yeah, it's funny because like there are many elements of New Orleans and its culture and life here that are very out of the ordinary for people from away. And I think like one of the difficulties in portraying those things faithfully but also dynamically is to sort of balance the strange with the lived in and the familiar. And I think people often kind of fail at that. Now, Baron Samedi, I'm not an expert on voodoo, but my understanding is that he is a Loa and one of the most
mm-hmm.
powerful ones. And like, I always had it in my head when he appears in that movie, like that's not the Jeffrey Holder character. That's something wearing his body that manifests and does its thing. Because that's generally how I understand that figure to present itself in real life. But don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
I I did not think of him as a. Oh, it's been a while since I've seen that movie. I need to watch it again. I hadn't thought of him as a Loa. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Ian Fleming didn't think of him as a Loa. When you read it that way, it is very, very radical because I thought the very same thing because I care a lot about trying to be like very deliberate about how voodoo is portrayed and works. But we're also talking about a guy who just bought part of Jamaica so he could build one house in it and barely live in it. Maybe we shouldn't actually trust Ian Fleming
Oh, for
or
sure.
the people who have adapted his works. I'm not even trying to be mean. I like James Bond, but the spycraft is a lot more thoughtful than any actual attempt at portraying any part of the world that is not in the United Kingdom. And some of the spycraft is also bad.
I wonder about the spycraft with that a lot. Like my dad worked for the State Department, and so every once in a while at post, like somebody would be hanging around who was clearly like CIA, and I'm like, how far removed is the James Bond character and his adventures from the life of an actual CIA guy or MI6 guy? Like, I would love to know. I would love to. Anyway.
I mean, there's also like the funny historical fact that like the actual MI6 work that Ian Fleming is most popularly remembered for as an intelligence agent are perhaps some of the most boring but also some of the most funny experiences in UK history. Like Ian Fleming worked on Operation Mincemeat. Operation Mincemeat was literally, let's just leave a dead British body with forged papers so the Germans will find it and think that we're going to strike in one place instead of another. And frustrate ourselves for a week and a half about whether the Germans have found the body yet. Like, that's the whole thing.
That's crazy.
That's more interesting than an actual James Bond book.
I mean, it really kind of
And yet it
is.
sounds so dull.
And I just wish that, we could have more movies and other creative properties based on some of those ins and outs in a either less or differently stylized kind of way. Like the best we get is like Men Who Stare at Goats. But if you're gonna do something about like these weird government programs to do these weird, crazy things, like, do you guys know about the dolphin that they tried to teach English to?
Yes.
Yeah, that's wild. I want so many movies about that. I also, there's also like that gay bomb that the military was trying to invent.
So what?
Okay, they were trying to invent a gay bomb, and the idea was that they would deploy this during a military action, and I guess it would like gay all over the enemy, and they would be so consumed with lust for each other that they would be locked in coitus and not even bother to stop the advancing army. And they spent millions of dollars on a bomb to turn people gay.
So many things about this are bad and stupid and wrong. By that logic, if someone made a similar bomb that was just supposed to deploy hallucinations of beautiful women, it would work the exact same way.
Right.
But if I get how military agents work, like we will have the sex later. Let's finish this battle first. I'm pretty sure this is hilarious to me.
It's some Bugs Bunny shit. And like, the thing is, on the one hand, I know that is stupid and like a really, like myopic kind of evil, but I can't say that I'm not a touch proud to live in a world where someone spent money trying to do that, Like,
Yeah.
like some things make the world just a little bit dumber and more interesting.
Yeah.
And that, I guess that
Yeah.
appeals to my comic's heart.
No, there are some things that they are so dumb that you do feel kind of charmed that we live in a world where someone can do something that stupidly evil instead of always being perfectly evil all the time. There is something kind of
Like,
endearing about that, actually.
just the idea that
Even if we wanted to destroy ourselves, we'd be very bad at it.
right, like a man woke up one morning and put on a suit and then drove his car to the Pentagon and then went
Mhm.
into a room where other
With
men were
several
wearing
chiefs
suits.
of staff and the president.
I hope the president wasn't anywhere near that. Oh my god.
No, I hope he was in the room, and I hope he said nothing. I hope he was like, I have no opinion for or against. Just test it out.
That's so wow. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they spent millions on it. I don't know.
I just want to believe that there was one, like, chief of staff or one high-ranking military official that was like, I'm no scientist, but this checks out. Like, I wanted to say exactly that.
Well, Mr. President, I don't have a dog in this hunt, but I will say that the gay ray or gay bomb is in the interest of national security, and we must support it with everything we have.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Well, I think that is a good time to remind folks this book is probably out by the time this is out, but if not, and it's not out just yet, it is out on the 21st of June, 2022. You can buy it where all the books are available, pretty much everywhere. Get it from your local bookstore if you can to support local bookstores, and buy 3,000 copies and give them to all your friends, because Alex needs to have a career that runs for the next 10,000 years, or at least as long as Alex wishes to have a career. I don't know if 10,000 years is a bit much, but,
In fact, here's a thing that you should do, even. Buy 3 dozen copies and donate it to your local high schools. Because I think that kids would really dig it.
Oh, thank you guys so much.
I'm super excited, and big congratulations to you, Alex, that this is now out. I remember hearing about it last year, and I was really stoked about it then, and now that it's here, I'm so happy.
Well, thank you so much.
So before we leave, Alex, would you let us know where folks can find you on the interwebs? If there's anything you'd like to let folks know that's coming out kind of in the next few months, that would be great too.
You can find me on Twitter and on Instagram as Magic Negro. That's MAGICKNEGRO. And, I like to promote stuff and write jokes and like ruminate about writing and subjects that are dear to me. Yeah, that's where I can be found.
Excellent.
Right. So, thank you again so very, very much for joining us for this podcast. This was a really cool discussion. A reminder to everyone in the audience that if you would like to let us know what you think about the Ballad of Perilous Graves when you get the chance to read it, or whatever, all of the other stuff that we discussed in this episode or any other episodes, please head on over to skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. Also, please follow us on at skiffyandfanty on Twitter and Instagram. Please, we do sometimes say interesting and funny things, so please follow us on the social medias and subscribe to our newsletter, skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. And finally, if you like hearing us talk, please support us on patreon.com/skiffyandfanty and give us some love. A 5-star review on iTunes is actually a big deal to us, so if you like our things, please give us some love. As for me, you can find me at The Rising Tides on Twitter, patreon.com/The Rising Tides, and on speculatorsf.com, where I currently GM Fractal Spire, a Girl by Moonlight actual play.
And you can find me at Sean Duke on Twitter, SeanDuke.net, Alphabet Streams on Twitch, and at patreon.com/The Joy Factory. And on that note, I'm also on Facebook. You can find me there too. Now I need to make it awkward.
I mean, you don't have to.
Well, no, it's required by the bylaws for Skiffy and Fanning. I have to make every episode end awkwardly. So I would just say that I am going to one day go to New Orleans and bring my trumpet that's been in my closet for a very long time. And then I'm just going to awkwardly sit in a corner with it in my lap and never play it, because I will in no way be able to properly play anything.
Well, it's a good time. You'll see a lot of really cool horn work. On Frenchman Street, they used to have cutting contests. I don't know if this is still a thing, where like different brass bands would face off against each other and try to outplay each other on the corner. Magical.
That
Beautiful.
Sounds rad.
Very cool.
That sounds actually really cool. I hope that I get to see some of that in November.
I'm sure we can make that happen.
Yes.
Yeah. Nice.
All right. Well, look, this one isn't awkward, so it's just an ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.